I remember the exact weight of that October evening. The air held that particular dampness that comes just before winter claims everything, when the last stubborn leaves cling to branches like secrets refusing to be told. Street lamps flickered against wet pavement, casting amber pools that seemed to float in the gathering darkness. The town had settled into its familiar quiet, that soft hush that descends when day workers have retreated behind their front doors and the night belongs to those of us still wandering. Elias walked beside me, his footsteps matching mine with an ease that had developed over weeks of these evening walks. We were not boys stumbling through first discoveries of ourselves. I was 38, a husband, a father. He was 34, alone by choice or circumstance. We moved through the world as grown men do, carrying the weight of responsibilities and carefully constructed lives. Yet something about those walks stripped away the armor we wore during daylight hours. Our conversation drifted over safe territories that evening. He mentioned the forecast, how the cold was settling in earlier than usual. I told him about the heating bill Clara had left on the kitchen counter, the small domestic details that fill up a married man's thoughts. We discussed the new cataloging system at the library, the way certain books seemed to migrate to wrong shelves as if they had lives of their own. Nothing consequential. Nothing that would explain what happened next. The moment arrives in memory like a photograph developing in slow motion. One instant my hand was empty, swinging naturally at my side as we passed beneath the old oak on Maple Street. The next, I felt the warmth of Elias's fingers sliding between mine. Not grabbing, not clutching, just settling there as if his hand had always belonged entwined with mine. My wedding ring pressed against his skin. The gold band that had circled my finger for 16 years suddenly felt foreign, a cold intrusion between us. I should have pulled away. Every rational thought demanded it. I was a married man walking through my own neighborhood, where any neighbor might glance out their window and see us, where Clara might drive past returning from her evening yoga class, where my daughter Naomi might be walking home from a friend's house. But I did not let go. Instead, I felt my fingers tighten slightly, accepting the offered intimacy. My heart hammered against my ribs as we continued walking. Our hands joined as naturally as if we had been doing this for years. The amber streetlight caught my wedding ring, making it wink like a guilty eye. In that moment, I understood that this simple gesture was not about comfort or friendship or any of the safe explanations I might try to construct later. This was about something I had spent decades refusing to name. Something forbidden that had been growing in the spaces between our conversations, in the lingering looks we shared over library shelves, in the way my pulse quickened whenever he appeared in my peripheral vision. Something inevitable that I had been walking toward without admitting it to myself. The silence between us felt orchestrated, as if the entire evening had been arranged for this single moment of connection. Our footsteps echoed softly against the quiet street. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Normal sounds of a normal night in a normal town, yet everything had shifted. I was still Julian, still the man who made coffee for his wife each morning and helped his daughter with geometry homework. But I was also becoming someone else entirely, someone who could hold another man's hand and feel more alive than he had in years. We walked the remaining 3 blocks to my corner without speaking, our joined hands the only conversation that mattered. When we finally stopped at the place where our paths typically diverged, Elias released my fingers slowly, reluctantly. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes holding questions I was not yet ready to answer. He said goodnight and headed toward his apartment. I watched him disappear into the darkness, then stood alone beneath the street lamp, staring at my empty hand. The skin where his fingers had rested still tingled with phantom warmth. My wedding ring felt heavier than ever, yet somehow I could not bring myself to regret what had just happened. I knew, standing there in the amber light with my heart still racing, that something fundamental had shifted. The careful life I had built, the roles I played so dutifully, the man I presented to the world each morning, all of it felt suddenly fragile, like a house of cards waiting for the slightest breeze to scatter everything. The house I returned to that night existed in shades of beige and cream, colors Clara had chosen for their calming properties. She believed in the psychology of neutral tones, in creating spaces that soothed rather than stimulated. Walking through our front door was like stepping into a carefully curated museum of domestic contentment. The scent of lavender fabric softener lingered in the hallway. Fresh flowers sat arranged in a crystal vase on the entry table, replaced every Thursday without fail. I moved through these rooms like an actor who had grown tired of his role but could not remember any other lines. The living room held our sectional sofa positioned exactly 18 inches from the coffee table, the distance Clara had measured for optimal flow. Family photographs lined the mantel in matching silver frames. Our wedding day, Naomi's school pictures progressing year by year, vacation snapshots from beach houses and mountain cabins where we had smiled on cue. Clara was in the kitchen when I arrived, wiping down counters that were already spotless. She had changed from her work clothes into the comfortable pants and oversized sweater she wore each evening, her auburn hair pulled back in the same low ponytail she had favored since college. She looked up when I entered and asked how my day had been. I told her it was fine, the same response I had given for months. She nodded and mentioned that Naomi was upstairs finishing her chemistry homework. Our 17-year-old daughter possessed Clara's practical nature, but with an intensity that sometimes startled me. She approached her studies with fierce determination, already planning her college applications with spreadsheets and color-coded calendars. When she looked at me, I sometimes caught glimpses of questions in her eyes, as if she sensed the distance growing between her parents but could not quite articulate what she observed. This was the life I had built over 16 years of marriage. Clara deserved better than the hollow version of myself I had become, though she seemed not to notice the gradual erosion of the man she had married. She organized our social calendar, managed our finances, maintained friendships with other couples in the neighborhood. I participated when required, playing my part with adequate competence but diminishing enthusiasm. My refuge had always been the library where I worked, though even there I had begun to feel like a misfiled book, shelved in the wrong section for so long that I had forgotten where I truly belonged. The Millfield Public Library occupied a brick building from the 1920s, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in golden afternoon light. I had worked there for 12 years, moving through the stacks with practiced efficiency, helping patrons locate mysteries and memoirs, processing returns, and organizing displays. The work suited my temperament. Books asked nothing of me except proper care and correct placement. They held their stories quietly until someone chose to open them. I envied their patience, their ability to wait indefinitely for the right reader to discover them. Elias had arrived 3 months earlier, transferred from the downtown branch when budget cuts eliminated his position there. He was younger than me by several years, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes that seemed to notice details others missed. While I moved through the library maintaining order, he moved through it creating small improvements, suggesting new displays, reorganizing the children's section to be more accessible, staying late to help elderly patrons navigate the computer terminals. He brought a different energy to our quiet workplace, not disruptive, but enlivening, like opening a window in a room that had been closed too long. He asked my opinion about book selections, complimented the efficiency of my cataloging system, sought my advice about difficult patrons. Gradually, we began taking our lunch breaks together, sitting in the small staff room discussing literature and local politics. The evening walks had begun accidentally. One Thursday in September, we had both worked late processing a large donation of books. When we finally locked the library doors, Elias mentioned that he lived in the same direction as me, just a few blocks further east. It seemed natural to walk together, our conversation continuing seamlessly from the topics we had been discussing inside. The route took us down Main Street past the antique shops and coffee houses, then through the residential neighborhood where I had lived for over a decade. Elias walked with an unhurried pace that matched my own, pausing occasionally to admire a particularly well-tended garden or comment on the architecture of the older homes. He noticed things I had stopped seeing. The way certain houses seemed to glow from within during the dinner hour, the intricate ironwork on Victorian porches, the massive oak trees that formed a canopy over the sidewalks. These walks gradually extended beyond the evenings when we worked late. We began timing our departures so that we left together most nights, finding excuses to linger at the library until closing time. Our conversations deepened during these twilight strolls. He told me about his childhood in Vermont, his degree in comparative literature that he had never quite figured out how to use, his decision to work in libraries because he believed in the democracy of free access to books. I found myself sharing memories I had not thought about in years, my college ambitions to become a writer, the poetry I had written in my 20s before marriage and mortgage payments crowded out such impractical pursuits. Elias listened with an attention that made me feel as though my words mattered, as though the dreams I had abandoned might still hold some value. The transformation was so gradual that I did not recognize it happening. I began looking forward to the end of each workday with an anticipation I had not felt in years. I started paying attention to details I had previously ignored. The way shadows fell across the library stacks in late afternoon, the sound of rain against the tall windows, the particular shade of gray that October evenings painted across the sky. At home, Clara began commenting that I seemed distracted. She asked if everything was all right at work, whether I was feeling stressed about the upcoming budget meetings. I assured her that nothing was wrong, but I could see the small line of concern that had appeared between her eyebrows. Naomi, with the sharp perception of teenagers, began watching me more carefully during our family dinners, though she said nothing. I was living two lives without yet understanding what that meant. During daylight hours, I maintained the routines that had sustained our household for years. But as evening approached, I felt myself awakening to possibilities I could not yet name, drawn towards something that made me feel more alive than I had and longer than I cared to remember. The shift that changed everything came on a Tuesday evening in late October. We had spent the afternoon processing returns, the mundane rhythm of checking in books and placing them on carts for reshelving. The work required no conversation, but I found myself acutely aware of Elias moving through the stacks nearby, his presence creating a gravitational pull I tried to ignore. As closing time approached, I began my usual ritual of straightening the reference section and powering down the computers. Elias finished his tasks and appeared at the front desk where I was counting the day's receipts. Instead of simply saying good night as he had for weeks, he paused and suggested we walk home together. Not because we happened to be leaving at the same time, but as a deliberate choice. The invitation hung in the air between us, simple yet weighted with possibility. I could have declined, could have mentioned an errand or a need to stay late. Instead, I heard myself agreeing, my voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of my heartbeat. We stepped into the crisp evening air, and something felt different immediately. Our usual polite distance seemed to compress. We walked closer together, our shoulders occasionally brushing as we navigated the narrow sidewalks. The conversation that emerged was unlike any we had shared before. Elias asked me about the books that had shaped me as a young man. Not the classics I might mention in professional settings, but the ones that had found me at crucial moments and altered something essential in my understanding of the world. I told him about discovering James Baldwin in college, how Giovanni's Room had stirred something in me I had been too frightened to examine closely. I mentioned the poetry of Adrienne Rich, the way her words about secrets and silences had resonated with feelings I could not yet articulate. He listened with an intensity that was intoxicating. Clara had never asked me these questions. In 16 years of marriage, our conversations had gradually narrowed to logistics and surface concerns. When had we stopped talking about the ideas that excited us, the dreams we carried, the regrets that shaped our choices? Elias shared his own formative books, speaking about authors who had given him permission to see the world differently. He talked about growing up in a small Vermont town where being different felt dangerous, how literature had provided refuge and eventually courage. His voice carried traces of old pain, but also a kind of acceptance I envied. We discussed the dreams we had abandoned, the practical compromises that had redirected our lives from their original trajectories. I found myself admitting things I had never said aloud, how I sometimes felt like I was sleepwalking through my own existence, how the security I had built felt increasingly like a beautifully decorated prison. These conversations became our ritual. What had started as occasional coincidence transformed into deliberate routine. I began inventing reasons to stay late at the library, volunteering for tasks that would keep me there until Elias finished his own work. I reorganized entire sections that did not need reorganization, created elaborate filing systems for patron requests, anything that would ensure our schedules aligned. The walks grew longer as autumn deepened. We discovered circuitous routes that added blocks to our journey, finding excuses to linger at street corners or pause in front of particularly interesting houses. One evening, we stopped at the all-night diner on the edge of downtown, sharing coffee and pie while continuing conversations that seemed to have no natural ending point. During these extended talks, I felt pieces of myself awakening that had been dormant for years. Elias asked questions that pierced through the comfortable assumptions of my daily life. He wondered why I had stopped writing, whether I ever missed the intensity of creating something entirely my own. He asked about my marriage in ways that were not invasive but genuinely curious, as if he could sense the complicated geography of a long relationship. I found myself being more honest than I had been with anyone in years. I admitted that Clara and I had become more like business partners than lovers, that we maintained our household with efficient cooperation but little passion. I confessed that I sometimes felt invisible in my own home, going through motions that had lost all meaning. Elias never offered judgment or advice. Instead, he provided something rarer, the gift of being truly seen. When I spoke, he listened not just to my words but to the silences between them, understanding things I was still learning about myself. The moment that would reshape everything arrived on a November evening when the first real cold snap had settled over our town. We had lingered later than usual at the library, and when we finally stepped outside, the wind cut through our jackets with surprising sharpness. The streetlights seemed brighter against the deeper darkness of winter's approach. As we walked, our conversation had grown quieter, more reflective. We were discussing loneliness, the different ways it could exist even in the midst of crowded lives. I was trying to articulate a feeling I had carried for years but never named. The sense of being fundamentally alone even when surrounded by family. The exhaustion of performing a role that no longer fit. Then, without warning or fanfare, I felt the warmth of Elias's hand sliding into mine. His fingers found the spaces between my own fingers as if they had been designed to fit there. The gesture was neither aggressive nor hesitant. It simply happened, like breathing or the natural turning of seasons. My wedding ring pressed against his skin, a cold reminder of the life I was supposed to be living. Every rational thought screamed warnings about neighbors, about Clara, about the catastrophic implications of this simple touch. But the warmth spreading up my arm seemed to awaken nerve endings I had forgotten I possessed. I did not pull away. Instead, my fingers tightened slightly around his, accepting what he offered. We continued walking as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, yet everything had changed. The familiar streets of my neighborhood looked different, painted with new possibilities and terrible risks. We reached my corner far too quickly. Elias released my hand slowly, his fingertips trailing across my palm before letting go completely. He said goodnight, his voice carrying undertones I was afraid to interpret. I watched him continue toward his apartment, my empty hand still tingling with phantom warmth. That night, I lay beside Clara staring at the ceiling while she slept peacefully next to me. Her steady breathing had always been comforting, a rhythm that anchored our shared life. Now it seemed to emphasize the distance between us, the careful space we maintained even in sleep. My hand still burned where Elias had touched it. I found myself replaying every moment of our walk, every word he had spoken, every glance that had lasted a heartbeat too long. I understood with terrifying clarity that something had been set in motion that could not be undone, a gravitational shift that would eventually pull apart the carefully constructed world I had spent 16 years building. The days that followed that first touch became an exercise in careful compartmentalization. I discovered I could function as two entirely different people, switching between them with a precision that both impressed and disturbed me. At home, I remained the reliable husband Clara had married, the attentive father Naomi deserved. But underneath that familiar performance, another version of myself was awakening. During morning coffee with Clara, I discussed practical matters with appropriate concern. The furnace needed servicing before winter deepened. Naomi's college application deadlines were approaching. Our joint checking account required a transfer from savings. I participated in these conversations with the same competence I had always shown, yet felt as though I was observing myself from a great distance. Clara seemed to notice only that I was quieter than usual, more contemplative. When she asked if I was feeling all right, I assured her it was just work stress, perhaps the seasonal change affecting my mood. She accepted these explanations with the trust of someone who had never imagined her husband capable of fundamental deception. With Naomi, I maintained our established rhythms. I helped her review chemistry formulas over breakfast, attended her school soccer games on weekends, listened to her concerns about college applications and social dynamics. Yet, even during these moments of genuine connection, part of my attention remained elsewhere, anticipating the evening hours when I would walk beside Elias. The contrast between these two worlds became more pronounced with each passing day. At the library, I found myself coming alive in ways I had almost forgotten were possible. Elias had a gift for drawing out versions of myself I had buried under years of routine. He asked questions that required me to remember who I had been before marriage and mortgage payments shaped my priorities. We began extending our evening walks well beyond our respective neighborhoods, discovering routes that could stretch a 20-minute journey into an hour-long exploration. Elias knew the town's hidden corners, a small park behind the old church where benches faced a pond, a tree-lined street where Victorian houses displayed intricate architectural details, a footbridge over the creek where we could pause and listen to water moving over stones. One evening in December, as light snow began falling, we found ourselves at Miller's Cafe, the only establishment in town that stayed open past 9 o'clock. The owner, an elderly man who had run the place for 30 years, served us coffee and apple pie while jazz music played softly from speakers hidden somewhere in the exposed brick walls. Sitting across from Elias in that dimly lit booth, I felt a lightness I had not experienced since my 20s. He made me laugh with stories about difficult library patrons, his observations about small-town characters, his gentle mockery of the bureaucratic absurdities that governed our workplace. When I laughed with him, the sound seemed to come from some deeper place than I had accessed in years. But laughter was only part of what drew me to him. In Elias's presence, I rediscovered a capacity for tenderness I thought had been lost. The way he listened to my words, the attention he paid to my thoughts, the patience he showed when I struggled to articulate feelings I barely understood, all of it awakened something that felt both familiar and entirely new. I began to recognize the man I had been before I learned to be careful, before I taught myself to want only what seemed safely attainable. With Elias, I could admit to dreams I had abandoned, regrets I carried, questions about my life that I had stopped asking. He never judged these confessions or tried to solve the dilemmas they revealed. Instead, he offered something more valuable: acceptance of complexity, understanding of the ways we all learn to compromise with our own desires. Yet even as these evening hours filled me with energy and possibility, the guilt that accompanied them was relentless. I would return home to find Clara reading in bed, her routine unchanged, her trust intact. She would ask about my day, and I would edit my responses carefully, mentioning colleagues and tasks while omitting the conversations that had mattered most. At dinner with my family, I watched Clara and Naomi discuss their own daily experiences and felt like a spectator observing their lives from behind glass. They existed in a world I was gradually leaving, though they could not yet see the distance growing between us. The guilt of this deception was sometimes overwhelming, yet not powerful enough to make me stop. I told myself repeatedly that Elias and I were simply friends, that the connection between us was intellectual and emotional rather than romantic. But my body understood truths my mind was not ready to accept. Every accidental brush of his hand against mine sent electricity through my nervous system. When he looked directly at me during our conversations, I felt exposed and seen in ways that were both thrilling and terrifying. The way he said my name carried undertones that made my pulse quicken. When we stood close together, I found myself memorizing details: the slight curl at the edge of his hair, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the particular timbre of his voice when he spoke quietly. These observations felt dangerous, like evidence of feelings I was not supposed to have. During the Christmas season, as our town decorated itself with lights and wreaths, I began carrying a small notebook. Initially, I told myself it was for jotting down book recommendations or library-related tasks. But gradually, the pages filled with something entirely different. I wrote about the way winter lights slanted through the library windows. I wrote about the sound of Elias's laughter. I wrote fragments of poems that captured feelings I could not speak aloud. The notebook became my secret pulse, the only place I dared admit what was happening to me. Late at night, when Clara slept beside me, I would retrieve it from its hiding place beneath the floorboards in my home office and write about longing in ways that felt both liberating and shameful. I wrote about the way time seemed to slow when Elias and I walked together, how ordinary streets transformed into landscapes of possibility. I wrote about the fear that accompanied every moment of connection, the terror of wanting something that could destroy the life I had built. Most dangerously, I wrote about love, the word I was afraid to think, let alone say. Because that was the truth I was finally forced to confront in those handwritten pages. I was falling in love with Elias, had perhaps been falling since our first conversation. Not the comfortable affection of long marriage, but something urgent and consuming that made me feel simultaneously more alive and more frightened than I had ever been. The recognition changed everything and nothing. I continued my daily routines, maintained my family obligations, performed my job with professional competence. But underneath it all, I carried this secret knowledge like a flame that could either warm me or burn down everything I had spent my adult life creating. Elias, with his characteristic patience, never forced me to name what was happening between us. He seemed to understand that I was navigating territory I had never explored, making discoveries about myself that required time to fully comprehend. His restraint was both a gift and a torment. It gave me space to understand my feelings, but also left me wondering whether I was the only one experiencing this transformation. As winter deepened and our walks continued, I realized I was living in a state of constant anticipation. Each day moved toward the evening hours when I could be authentically myself, when the careful performance of my daytime life could be set aside. I was becoming addicted to those moments of connection, dependent on the way Elias made me feel seen and understood. The danger of this double life was becoming apparent even to me. I was withdrawing from Clara and Naomi not intentionally, but inevitably, saving my emotional energy for the person who had awakened something I thought was permanently buried. The man who returned home each evening was increasingly a shadow of the man who came alive in Elias's presence, and I knew this imbalance could not continue indefinitely. The inevitable arrived on a Thursday evening in January, though I suppose it had been approaching for months like a storm gathering on a distant horizon. We had stayed late at the library processing a shipment of new releases, the familiar rhythm of unpacking boxes and updating catalog records extending well past closing time. By the time we finished, rain was hammering against the tall windows with a fury that had been building all day. When we finally switched off the lights and locked the heavy oak doors, we discovered that the gentle afternoon drizzle had transformed into a winter deluge. The awning over the library entrance provided minimal shelter, and neither of us had brought an umbrella. Water cascaded from the gutters in steady streams, turning the sidewalks into shallow rivers that reflected the streetlights in fractured patterns. We stood there together, shoulders almost touching, watching the rain transform our familiar town into something foreign and dreamlike. The logical thing would have been to dash to our respective cars, to hurry home through the downpour to the warm, dry spaces where we belonged. Instead, we lingered under that narrow canopy of protection, neither willing to be the first to suggest we part ways. The silence between us felt different that evening, charged with something that had been building through weeks of careful conversations and stolen glances. I could feel the heat of Elias's body beside me, could hear his breathing beneath the drumming of rain on metal and glass. The space between us seemed to pulse with unspoken possibilities. Then, without looking at me directly, he spoke the words that would shatter the careful equilibrium we had maintained. "Do you ever feel like you've been living someone else's life?" he asked. His voice was quiet, barely audible above the storm, but the question hit me with the force of recognition. I felt something crack open inside my chest. The question was so perfectly articulated, so precisely aimed at the core of everything I had been feeling but could not name, that for a moment I could not breathe. He had given voice to the central dilemma of my existence. The growing sense that the man I presented to the world bore little resemblance to whoever I actually was underneath. I turned to face him, intending to give some careful, measured response that would acknowledge the depth of his question without revealing too much. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw my own hunger reflected there, my own desperate longing for something real and honest and alive. The distance between us seemed to collapse. He moved closer, or perhaps I did. Or perhaps we both gravitated toward each other like celestial bodies responding to an irresistible gravitational pull. I felt his hand touch my face, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw with a gentleness that made me tremble. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, we looked at each other with complete understanding. Then his lips touched mine. The kiss was brief, lasting no more than a few seconds, yet it detonated inside me like a depth charge that had finally reached its intended target. Every nerve ending in my body seemed to ignite simultaneously. My hands, acting without conscious direction, reached for him, one settling on his waist while the other found the back of his neck, pulling him closer before rational thought could intervene. In that moment, I felt more alive than I had in years. Electric, terrified, complete. Every carefully constructed wall I had built around my desires crumbled in an instant, leaving me exposed and raw and desperately hungry for more. The taste of him, the warmth of his mouth, the way he melted against me, it was everything I had been denying myself without even knowing I was doing it. Reality crashed back over me like cold water. I pulled away abruptly, my hands dropping to my sides as if they had been burned. The words tumbled out of me in a rush of panic and guilt. "I cannot do this," I told him. "I have a family. I have responsibilities. This is impossible." Elias stepped back, giving me space, but his eyes never left my face. He nodded slowly, as if he had expected this response, perhaps even prepared himself for it. But I could see the truth written clearly in his expression. The feelings between us were mutual, undeniable, dangerous in their intensity. He had felt the same electric connection, the same desperate hunger that was now threatening to tear apart everything I thought I knew about myself. He said he understood, that he had not meant for it to happen. But even as he spoke these reasonable words, I could see that he was not sorry any more than I was. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, acknowledged something that could not be taken back. The rain began to slow, reducing from a torrent to a steady patter. Without discussing it, we both knew our evening had ended. Elias said good night with the same quiet voice he always used, as if the last few minutes had not just rewritten the fundamental terms of our relationship. I watched him walk into the diminishing storm, his figure growing smaller and more indistinct until he disappeared entirely around the corner. I stood alone under the library awning for several more minutes, my lips still burning from his kiss, my heart hammering against my ribs like something caged and desperate for release. When I finally forced myself to move, my legs felt unsteady, as if I had forgotten how to navigate ordinary physical space. The drive home passed in a blur of rain-slicked streets and traffic lights bleeding their colors into the wet darkness. I parked in my driveway and sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house where my family was waiting. Through the living room window, I could see the warm glow of lamps, the comfortable domesticity I had helped create and maintain for 16 years. Clara was reading when I finally came inside. curled into her usual corner of the sofa with a mystery novel and a cup of tea. She looked up when I entered, her eyes registering my wet hair and flushed face. She asked if I had gotten caught in the storm, whether I was feeling all right. I managed some response about heavy rain and working late, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Naomi appeared from the kitchen, announcing that she had finished her calculus homework and asking if I could review her college essay draft before she went to bed. I agreed, though I could barely focus on her words. She studied my face with the sharp perception of a teenager who had grown up watching her parents' every mood and gesture. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "You look different tonight." Different. The word echoed in my mind as I helped her with semicolons and paragraph transitions, as I made appropriate responses to Clara's comments about her book, as I went through the motions of being a husband and father while feeling like an imposter occupying someone else's life. Later, when both Clara and Naomi had gone to bed, I found myself standing in the bathroom staring at my reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. The man looking back at me was familiar. The same brown hair now showing threads of gray at the temples, the same blue eyes, the same face I had been wearing for 38 years. Yet he seemed like a stranger. This was not the husband who made coffee for Clara each morning, not the father who attended Naomi's soccer games, not the librarian who processed returns with methodical efficiency. Instead, I saw someone I had almost forgotten existed. The boy who had once written poetry and dreamed of living authentically. The young man who had buried his deepest desires so thoroughly that he had convinced himself they no longer existed. But they had been there all along, waiting with infinite patience for someone like Elias to awaken them. That boy, that young man, that authentic self I had sacrificed for the sake of conventional happiness, he had never truly died. He had simply been waiting, growing stronger in the darkness, preparing for this moment of recognition. I gripped the edge of the sink and closed my eyes, feeling the full weight of what had just happened. One kiss had not only awakened feelings I thought were gone forever, it had revealed that my entire adult life had been built on a foundation of self-deception. I was not the man I pretended to be. I never had been. And now, finally, terrifyingly, I was being forced to confront who I actually was underneath all the careful layers of respectability and duty I had spent decades constructing. The days following that kiss became an exercise in barely controlled panic. I moved through my familiar routines like someone recovering from a severe illness, going through the motions while feeling fundamentally altered at a cellular level. Every surface in my house seemed to reflect back evidence of my deception. Every conversation with Clara felt like walking through a minefield where any wrong step might detonate the careful life we had built together. She began watching me with the particular attention that comes from 16 years of marriage, the way a person notices when something essential has shifted in their daily landscape. At breakfast, she observed the way I stirred my coffee without drinking it. During dinner, she noted how I responded to questions a beat too late, as if translating her words from a foreign language. When she spoke about weekend plans or household repairs, I heard my own voice agreeing to things I could not quite remember consenting to. Naomi proved even more perceptive than her mother. Teenagers possess a radar for adult emotional turbulence that is both annoying and uncannily accurate. She began asking pointed questions about whether I felt well, whether work was stressing me out, whether something had happened that I needed to talk about. Her concern was genuine and heartbreaking, made worse by the fact that I could not possibly explain what was actually troubling me. The notebook I had been keeping became both salvation and torment. Late at night, when the house settled into sleep around me, I would retrieve it from its hiding place and write with desperate intensity about the collision happening inside me. The pages filled with fragments of longing, half-finished poems about desire and guilt, detailed descriptions of conversations with Elias that I replayed obsessively in my mind. Writing became the only way I could process what was happening to me. On paper, I could admit the truth that terrified me, that the kiss had not been an aberration or moment of weakness, but a revelation of who I actually was underneath decades of careful self-construction. I could confess that I thought about Elias constantly, that I had memorized the exact sound of his laugh, that I found excuses to walk past his desk at work just to be near him for a few seconds. But these written confessions felt dangerous, like evidence that could condemn me if discovered. Each night after writing, I would read over what I had recorded and feel simultaneously relieved and horrified by my own honesty. The man revealed in those pages bore little resemblance to the husband and father my family believed me to be. At work, Elias and I maintained a careful professional distance that felt like its own form of torture. We spoke when necessary about library business, but avoided the personal conversations that had become the foundation of our connection. When we passed each other in the stacks, the air between us seemed to crackle with unfinished business. I caught him looking at me sometimes with an expression I could not decipher, questioning, patient, perhaps waiting for some signal about what would happen next. The evening walk stopped entirely. The absence of those hours felt like losing a limb, leaving me restless and displaced when the workday ended. I would drive home directly, arrive earlier than usual, and find Clara surprised by my presence. She would comment positively about my being home for dinner, not understanding that my punctuality was born of cowardice rather than renewed dedication to family time. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening in February. Clara had prepared one of my favorite meals, pot roast with root vegetables, the kind of comfort food she made when she sensed I needed nurturing. Naomi was in a cheerful mood, telling us about her acceptance to her first-choice college, her excitement about starting fresh somewhere new. I should have been celebrating with them, should have been present for these moments that marked important passages in our family's life. Instead, I sat at our kitchen table feeling like I was watching them through glass. Their voices seemed to come from a great distance. When Clara asked me direct questions about work, about plans for Naomi's graduation party, about anything that required my full attention, I found myself struggling to focus long enough to provide coherent responses. Naomi finally stopped talking mid-sentence and stared at me. "Dad," she said, "what is wrong with you lately? You're acting so weird." Clara set down her fork and fixed me with the look I had been dreading, the expression of someone who has reached the end of her patience with polite concern and is ready to demand real answers. "Julian," she said quietly, "we need to talk." After dinner, the meal continued in tense silence. I helped clear the dishes with mechanical precision, every movement feeling deliberate and strange. Naomi disappeared upstairs to finish homework, leaving Clara and me alone in the kitchen that had been the center of our domestic life for so many years. Clara dried her hands on a dish towel and turned to face me. Her expression was not angry, but it carried a gravity that made my stomach clench with anticipation. She asked me to sit down at the table, then took the chair across from me, the same configuration we used for serious conversations about finances or Naomi's education or other weighty family matters. She told me she had been watching me for weeks, that she could see I was somewhere else even when I was physically present. She asked if I was having problems at work, whether I was worried about money, if there was something wrong with my health that I had not shared with her. Her questions were gentle but persistent, coming from a place of genuine care that made my guilt feel even more crushing. I tried to deflect, to offer vague reassurances about stress and seasonal mood changes. But Clara had known me for too long to accept these surface explanations. She pressed further, her voice growing more insistent. "Something has changed," she said. "Something fundamental. And I need to understand what it is." Then she said the words that stopped my heart. "I found your notebook, Julian." The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. I stared at her, my mind racing through possibilities. Which notebook? How much had she read? What exactly did she know? As if reading my thoughts, she retrieved it from the counter where she had placed it earlier, the small leather-bound journal I had believed was safely hidden. She set it on the table between us, its innocent appearance belying the explosive contents within its pages. "I read some of it," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "The poems. The confessions. I don't understand everything, but I understand enough." My hands began to shake. The careful walls I had built around my secret life were crumbling in real time, and I felt simultaneously terrified and relieved that the pretense was finally ending. Clara opened the notebook to a page she had marked and read aloud one of the poems I had written about longing, about feeling alive for the first time in years, about hands that fit perfectly with mine. When she finished reading, she looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before, not anger, not hurt, but a kind of devastating clarity. "There's someone else, isn't there?" she said. It wasn't a question. I wanted to lie, to find some way to protect her from the truth that would shatter our life together. But sitting there in our kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the deception I had been living, I could not bring myself to add more dishonesty to the mountain I had already constructed. I nodded. She asked the question I had been dreading most. "Do you love him?" The word hung between us like a blade. I could have qualified it, could have explained the complexity of what I felt, could have tried to minimize its impact. Instead, I heard myself whisper the truth that would change everything. Yes. The sound of that single word seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Clara's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, pain, something that might have been relief at finally understanding what had been wrong. She closed the notebook slowly and placed her hands flat on the table, staring down at them as if they might provide answers to questions she was only beginning to know how to ask. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "How long?" she asked. I told her about Elias, about the walks, about the gradual awakening of feelings I had not known I was capable of experiencing. I confessed that I had not intended for any of it to happen, that I had fought against it even as I was surrendering to it. I admitted that I no longer knew how to be the husband she deserved, that I was not even sure I knew who I was anymore. Clara listened without interrupting, absorbing revelations that were reshaping her understanding of our entire marriage. When I finished talking, she sat quietly for several minutes, processing information that must have felt like learning that gravity worked differently than she had always believed. Finally, she stood up from the table. Her movements were careful, controlled, as if she was afraid that any sudden gesture might cause her to shatter. She told me she needed time to think, that she could not continue this conversation tonight. She walked toward the stairs, then paused at the doorway. "I've known something was wrong for months," she said without turning around. "I just never imagined it was this." After she disappeared upstairs, I remained alone in the kitchen, staring at the notebook that had become the instrument of my confession. My wedding ring felt impossibly heavy on my finger, a weight I had carried for 16 years that suddenly seemed unbearable. My chest felt simultaneously hollow and burning, as if something essential had been removed while something else caught fire in the empty space. I knew, sitting there in the aftermath of honesty, that our marriage had just shifted into territory from which there would be no return. Not necessarily toward divorce, but toward a truth that would require us to rebuild everything we thought we knew about each other and ourselves. The life I had been so careful to preserve was ending, replaced by something uncertain and frightening and possibly, eventually, more authentic than anything I had lived before. The days that followed our kitchen confession moved with the strange, suspended quality of time after an earthquake, when the immediate shock has passed, but the aftershocks continue to reshape the landscape in ways both subtle and profound. Clara and I did not have dramatic arguments or tear-filled confrontations. Instead, we began the careful process of dismantling a life we had built together, piece by quiet piece. She asked me to move into the spare room, a request delivered with the same practical tone she might use to discuss rearranging furniture. I packed my clothes and books with methodical precision, trying not to think about what this physical separation represented. The spare room had served as my home office for years, so it already contained traces of my presence: my desk, my reading chair, shelves lined with books I had accumulated over decades. Now it would become my bedroom, a space where I could sleep without the constant reminder of everything I was about to lose. Naomi sensed the shift immediately, though we had not yet told her anything explicitly. She watched me carry my belongings down the hall with the sharp awareness of a teenager who had grown up observing the subtle dynamics of her parents' marriage. At dinner, she asked pointed questions about why I was sleeping in the office, whether Mom and I were having problems, if this had anything to do with my recent strange behavior. Clara handled these conversations with a grace I did not deserve. She explained that we were going through some difficulties, that we needed space to figure things out, that sometimes adults had to make changes even when they were painful. She protected me from having to provide explanations I was not yet ready to give, while also protecting Naomi from details that would only cause her unnecessary pain. But I could see in my daughter's eyes a mixture of confusion, sorrow, and something else, a kind of curiosity, as if she was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. The man who had been going through motions was being replaced by someone more present, but also more troubled, someone who was finally feeling things deeply enough for them to show on the surface. At work, Elias and I continued our careful professional distance, though the dynamic between us had changed since that rain-soaked evening. We no longer avoided each other entirely, but we also did not seek out the intimate conversations that had once been the foundation of our connection. Sometimes I would catch him watching me with patient eyes, as if he could sense the upheaval happening in my home life without needing me to explain it. 3 weeks after Clara found my notebook, he approached me as I was shelving returns in the poetry section. Without preamble, he asked if I would like to take a walk after work. His voice carried none of the careful neutrality we had been maintaining, and I understood that he was offering something I desperately needed. A return to the honesty we had shared before fear made me retreat. I agreed. That evening, we walked the familiar routes we had traveled together throughout the autumn and early winter. But everything felt different now. We moved with a kind of careful awareness, like people navigating around something fragile that could shatter if touched too directly. We did not hold hands. The physical intimacy that had awakened something profound in me now felt like a luxury we could not afford, at least not yet. Instead, we talked. I told him about Clara's discovery, about the conversation that had finally brought my secret into the open. I described the strange relief of no longer having to maintain the exhausting performance of being someone I was not, mixed with the devastating guilt of watching my family absorb the impact of my honesty. Elias listened with the same patient attention he had always given me, asking gentle questions but offering no easy solutions. He did not suggest that I leave Clara immediately, did not push for declarations about our future together. Instead, he seemed to understand that I was in the midst of a process that would require time to complete, that freedom from one life did not automatically mean the beginning of another. He told me about his own experiences with living authentically, the years he had spent learning to accept parts of himself that the world had taught him to hide. He spoke about loneliness and courage, about the difference between being alone and being lonely, about the ways we sometimes have to lose everything we think we want in order to discover who we actually are. As we walked, I realized that this was not a dramatic love story with sweeping declarations and grand gestures. This was something quieter and more complex, two people helping each other navigate toward versions of themselves they had never quite dared to become. Whatever lay ahead for us would unfold slowly, carefully, with full acknowledgement of the costs involved. When we reached the corner where our paths diverged, we stopped and faced each other. The air between us felt heavy with everything we were not yet ready to say, everything we hoped might someday be possible. Elias reached out and touched my hand briefly, a gesture of connection that carried no demands but offered enormous comfort. He told me to be patient with myself, to remember that transformation is rarely quick or easy. Then he walked toward his apartment, leaving me standing under the streetlight with a sense of possibility I had not felt in weeks. That night, I returned to a house that no longer felt like home, but was not yet something else. Clara was reading in the living room, a scene that had played out thousands of times throughout our marriage. She looked up when I entered and asked how my evening had been. For the first time in months, I answered honestly. I told her I had walked with Elias, that we had talked about the future, that I was trying to figure out how to move forward without causing more damage than necessary. She nodded and returned to her book. Not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. A recognition that we were both learning to live with a truth that had changed everything between us. Over the following weeks, we began the practical discussions that divorce requires. Not with lawyers yet, but with the careful attention to fairness that people show when they are trying to end something without destroying each other in the process. We talked about Naomi's college expenses, about how to divide assets accumulated over 16 years, about who would keep the house, and how we might explain our separation to friends and family. These conversations were painful but necessary, each one a small step away from the life we had shared toward whatever individual futures awaited us. Clara proved to be generous in ways that made my guilt even more acute, but also gave me hope that we might emerge from this process as friends rather than enemies. The symbolic moment I had been both dreading and anticipating came on a Thursday evening in March. I was standing in the kitchen, preparing to make myself dinner in what had once been our shared space, but now felt like a place I was borrowing temporarily. Clara had taken Naomi out to look at apartments near her future college, leaving me alone in the house for the first time since our conversation. I found myself looking at my wedding ring, the gold band that had circled my finger for 16 years. It had become a weight I carried everywhere, a constant reminder of promises I could no longer keep, of a version of myself I was no longer able to sustain. I worked the ring off slowly, feeling the slight resistance as it passed over my knuckle. Then I set it on the kitchen counter, placing it carefully next to the fruit bowl where Clara would find it later. My hand felt strangely light without its familiar weight, as if I had been carrying something heavier than I realized. Standing there in the quiet kitchen, I took a breath that felt different than any I had drawn in years. Not easy, not free of pain, but honest. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was breathing as myself. Not as the husband I had tried to be, not as the father I thought I should be, but as the man I actually was underneath all the careful constructions. I did not know what would happen next. The future stretched ahead of me, uncertain and frightening and full of possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. But I was no longer pretending, and that felt like the beginning of everything.